You can summarize Athanasius's method of theology as this: the only system of thought into which Jesus Christ will fit is the one in which he's the starting point. You can't start without Jesus and then crowbar Jesus in later.
Yeah, I understand your argument here, but here's the problem. Genesis 1, not John 1, is the story of the beginning, and this is the very point that I am making. So if you were an Israelite alive at the time when Jesus was on the earth, not only do you only have Genesis 1 and not John 1 to go by, but remember, this isn't a quote of Jesus. This is John saying this after Jesus has passed from the scene. So you have no access to John 1. Now, if you were alive around the year 90 when John writes this and you read it, you would have the opportunity to consider what John is saying. But nowhere in Genesis does it say that Jesus was in the beginning. This is John's idea. Now, John says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And then he goes on to say, and the Word was God. But then he goes on to say that all things were made through him, the Word, and without him was not anything made that was made. So we could take that back to Genesis 1, and I'm just going to steelman your argument here for a second. In Genesis 1, we have God creating by his word, let there be light, and there was light. And then in Genesis 1:27, we get, 1:26, we get, let us make man in our image, right? So we have some kind of plurality here, and God is creating by his word. So all of this would make sense of John 1. But if I'm right, what John is doing in John 1 is he's using the crowbar to pry apart the parts of Genesis 1 so that he can jam Jesus in there, and Jesus doesn't naturally fit. Now, before I get to that example, let me look at two others I got in my comments, either here on TikTok or over on YouTube. So another example that Christians use was Genesis 3:15, where we get the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman, and he will bruise his heel and he will crush his head. So there's some offspring of the woman that's going to defeat the curse that has been placed on humanity or the ground, or however you want to view it, right? And so Christians obviously see this as Jesus. They look back, Jesus is the one who defeats that curse. Now the problem is, if you go forward to Genesis 5, Noah is introduced in the genealogy, and we are told that this is the one who will save us from the curse on the ground. I believe it's verse 29 in Genesis 5. Why would I go 1,000 years later instead of going to 2 chapters later, right? So clearly, to the author of Genesis, we are saved from that curse by Noah and not Jesus. Christians use, again, they use the New Testament as a pry bar to pry that open and slide Jesus into that prophecy. Here's another one for you. We get the story in Genesis of the binding of Isaac, right? And in this story, Abraham's taking Isaac to sacrifice him, and Isaac says, hey, we got everything for the sacrifice except the animal. Where's the animal? And Abraham says, God will provide a lamb, right? So they go up the mountain, and sure enough, God provides a ram. But that's not good enough for Christians. They say, no. Jesus is the lamb that God will provide. But it's right there in the story. Now, you might say, well, Steve, that's a ram, not a lamb. And I would point out that Jesus is a man, not a lamb, right? But Jesus is symbolically the sacrificial animal, just like the ram was literally the sacrificial animal, right? Again, this is Christians using the New Testament as a crowbar to try to pry it open and slide Jesus into this story where he just clearly isn't there. But what does any of this have to do with John in Genesis 1? So in Genesis 1:26, we get the first of 3 us statements by God, where it seems like there's some kind of plurality there, right? More than one. It's us. Let us make man in our image. We get the next one in Genesis 3, right? After they eat the fruit, God says, behold, the man has become like one of us. Not like me, right? Like one of us. And then in Genesis 11, right after the Tower of Babel, we get God saying, let us go down and divide up the people and separate their languages, right? And so that's what happens. God goes down and divides up the people and sets their boundaries and their languages, right? Prior to that, they were all of one language, the text tells us. Now, what's interesting about this is these three us stories end with this dividing of the boundaries and in the separation of the people. And if we go to Deuteronomy 32, I think it's verse 8, we get the same thing, right? Moses is speaking. And he says, when the Most High divided up the nations, when he set the boundaries according to the number of the sons of God, according to the number of the gods, right? And Israel became Yahweh's portion. So here, this explains everything that was going on. Who's the us? It's the sons of God. Sons, plural, the B'nai Elohim. The sons or the children of God, or more literally translated, the gods. See, God isn't alone in Genesis 1 because there are sons of God or gods with God, but not the Son of God and not the Holy Spirit. And any Christian would say that's absolute heresy to say there are gods. There's one God and three persons, right? So these are the problems that you run into. What you're doing here is, yes, you're taking the crowbar that John 1 gave you and you're prying apart the verses of Genesis 1 to try to squeeze Jesus in there. But for anybody who doesn't have that motivation that is given to them by the New Testament, Jesus just isn't there, man. He's absent. And that's my point, right? If you have to pry Jesus and put him in at the end, it doesn't work. And that's the point that Glenn Scrivener, listen, he is a very devout, very fundamentalist Christian. That's the point he was making. I agree with him 100%. The problem is, it's exactly what the New Testament does. It pries apart the boards and tries to squeeze Jesus into a text where he never was in the first place.